It's Mo. It is February 4th, and that means that it's time to start a new vlog-style monthly reading wrap-up. I talk about the books that I've read throughout the month as close to when I've read them as I can manage. I try to talk for only about 5 minutes about each book. These videos get very, very long. I just tell you about the book and my reading experience. The first book that I finished so far in February was Dare to Dream, Coretta Scott King and the Civil Rights Movement by Angela Shelf Medeiros, and illustrated by Anna Rich. This is a middle grade book. I'm trying this year to get through some of the middle grade and YAs that I have in order to not pick up as many or to be more selective about the ones that I pick up. This one I picked up in 2025. It's very cute, sweet. I got it at a used library sale. You know, it's an interesting topic to me, certainly, and a great introduction to this topic of Coretta Scott King. Coretta Scott King was an aspiring singer born in the South who married Martin Luther King Jr. This tells her very simplified story. Obviously, this is for middle grade, for young adult readers, for an introduction to not only Coretta, but the civil rights movement in general. And I think this was a really great version of it because it didn't shy away from some of the harder topics. It did use simplified language and it did use softer language than many books that are written for adults about this topic. So there is talk of racism. They use the word racism. They don't define it, which I think is a little bit of a flaw. Like, I wish there was a little section in the back that was a definition of some of the words that they use, just so that if this is the first book about the civil rights movement and about Black Americans that you are reading to your children or to your students or whatever, you have a little help with how to discuss some of those things, because this book definitely brought up a lot of things that you could discuss. It talks about racism. It talks about the racism that her father faced. She grew up in a small town in Georgia where it was like a whole Black town. So within the town itself, she didn't face that much racism, but as soon as she moved out to larger cities in Georgia, or if they had to travel to larger cities, that's where she saw a lot of that racism. That's where everything was segregated between Black and whites more starkly in her mind. Also, that's where when her father tried to start various businesses, his life was threatened, his house was burnt down, his workplaces were burnt down because the people did not want him to be a businessman that could straddle both the Black and the white side of this area in Georgia. And then it goes through her leaving Georgia, going to school in Ohio. It talks about her relationship with her parents and with her sister, and then meeting Martin Luther King Jr. The majority of this is not about him, though, which I really liked. It really was about her and her life. So I thought this was an amazing introduction. Like I said, it very plainly talks about a lot of the hard real life things like racism, like death threats, like segregation, all of that stuff. And it is a really good, I think, jumping off point. But I do think if you're reading this to younger readers, or if you're helping younger readers read this, you might want to have a little list ready of some of the topics and some of the words and how to explain some of the things that are talked about in here. But it was great. The next book that I finished in February is Incensed by Ed Lin. This is the second in the Taipei Night Market mystery series. It's not a mystery series. This is what I was thinking about when I was reading it. I was like halfway through and I was like, when is the mystery gonna happen? Because the only thing that our main character Jingnan thought was mysterious was very obvious to the reader, so it was not a mystery at all. These are really crime novels. These are not mystery novels. The first book in this series is Ghost Month, and we meet Jingnan, who is a Taiwanese native, a Taipei native, but we meet him once he's returned to Taipei from America. So he went away to school in America. And when we first meet him in the first book, he's just found out that his old sweetheart, who he always thought that he was going to get back together with, his first true love, who he really planned to eventually marry, has been found dead. So that one is much more of a mystery because he is trying to solve her murder and he is trying to figure out what happened between them that caused the rift that never saw them come back together. And then in this book, that mystery is over and now he's living his life working in the night market. You meet the same cast of characters, the two friends that he has who work in the night market with him, his new girlfriend that he picks up in the first book, and we learn about more of his family members that live further out. And through those things, we come across these crimes, and Jingnan has to help solve the crimes. But again, it's not really a mystery. The first book felt much longer than this, and it had a lot of build-up and character development. It was very slow. These two have been pretty slow, and there's a lot of talk of Jingnan's love of music and his favorite band, and a lot of talk of history of Taiwan and Taipei. That part I loved, but it definitely in the first book read a little bit more like, here's all the things I want to talk about, here's all the things I love, I'm going to put all that information into a novel, and it didn't necessarily 100% work for me. Whereas I think Incensed really takes the most dynamic parts of the first novel and creates them into a better, more fun, more fast-paced, but still not super fast-paced crime novel. I definitely think you should read the first one. I like the first one a lot. I read both of these on audio. Weirdly, they had two different audio narrators. So the first one is narrated by someone else, and then the rest in the series, because I believe there are two more after this one, are all read by the same reader. And I do think that that is part of it too. I think this reader was a little bit more dynamic and was a little bit easier to read. But overall, I really, really liked it. Like, I left this book when it ended being like, oh, I kind of want to just like jump into the next one. But because I don't own the next one and I'm still working on my Read What You Own challenge, I did not do that. But I will definitely be reading more in this series. And I love Edlin. I love his writing, so I will definitely be reading more Edlin. I wish he would come out with something new soon. So those are the first two books that I read in February, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is February 9th. The next book that I finished so far in February was Cassandra at the Wedding by Dorothy Baker. This is a queer modern classic about two sisters, twins, one of whom has been living in, I think, San Francisco, and she is going home because her twin, who had been living in New York, is home and getting married. So Cassandra and Judith have been best friends, have lived in this very insular, isolated family for their whole lives, lived together when they first went to college, and then Judith decided to go to Juilliard in New York to pursue her musical career. And Cassandra was not stoked on this. She was not happy, but she didn't hold her sister back. And now, very unexpectedly, Cassandra is having to go back home to their Northern California farm town to watch her sister get married. So Cassandra is a really interesting character. We can tell right away from the beginning that Cassandra is not happy about this wedding, that she is hoping that this wedding is not going to take place, that she is trepidatious about going home and seeing her family. She talks a lot about her mother, who died a few years ago. So at home, it's just her father, her mother's mother, who lives with her father, and now Judith and her betrothed are there, and Cassandra is going home. And assorted cats and dogs. Right off the bat, we can see too that Cassandra is very affected by her sister's departure to New York, as well as this new predicament of the wedding, and she's not doing the best. She talks a lot about drinking and not eating much, talks about kind of her mental health and her seeing a psychologist, psychiatrist since Judith has been gone. So the majority of this book is once Cassandra gets home and her interactions with her family, and it's told in a very like clipped, precise way. Their father is a professor, and he doesn't like people to use like hyperbole. He doesn't like people to use exaggerated phrases or words. He likes to say things like very specifically as they are. So like, don't say bathing suit, say swimming costume. You can see that this has like affected Cassandra and affected Judith. And the majority of this book is told from Cassandra's perspective. And then we do get a little piece kind of in the middle towards the end of Judith speaking to us as well. And I loved this book. I thought it was so great. It really felt like a book that was kind of made for me. There's this pervasive feeling of isolation, but also want to be isolated that we get from Cassandra's perspective and from the description of her family and of her relationship with Judith. And we see that every move and every decision that Cassandra makes is to keep her family, and especially Judith and herself, isolated and insular among themselves, and how that's really her preferred nature. And it's both her way of protecting herself, it's what she likes, it's what she wants, and then also it's not necessarily good for her and not necessarily good for Judith. From Cassandra's perspective, you get this very alien feeling that you are alienated from other people, that you're even alienated from Judith, because Cassandra is feeling very alienated from Judith, which felt very familiar and comfortable to me. And I just, I love the way this one was told. It definitely took some twists and turns that I was not expecting. Even though everything is supposed to be very plainly said, there is a lot, especially between Cassandra and Judith, that is not explicitly said. And so as the reader, we're reading in between the lines and we're definitely understanding what Cassandra's meaning is, but it's not always coming across to other people that she's talking to, which made me feel very close to Cassandra's character and made me feel, I don't know, just, it was very weirdly familiar and comforting to read this book. And then there is quite a bit of speculation over Cassandra and whether Cassandra is queer. I think it's clear that Cassandra is queer, but it's unclear whether Judith is also queer. It's unclear whether Cassandra has had a lot of relationships with women. It's unclear what some of the relationships that come up in this book that are outside of the family mean to Cassandra. So there are a couple of people that are mentioned, and some of them make appearances in this book that probably Cassandra did have relationships with that were more than just friends. It was an interesting way to do it because, again, there is this reiteration by Cassandra, by her father, by Judith, to speak very plainly, to say exactly what you mean and exactly what's going on. But then there's this kind of hidden queerness and this idea that maybe the people who are close to Cassandra are close in different ways than they're letting on. And it was very sad. It was funny and it was sweet, but overall I just really, really loved it. And another amazing queer classic that I'm so glad to have read. I can't wait to read more by Dorothy Baker. Apparently all her works have queer themes. She was a queer woman who was married to a man who stayed married to a man, but she let her friends know that she was queer. So all of her books have these themes, and I'm interested to see, not from a female perspective, because I think her other books are from male perspectives, like how she weaves that in and out. The next book that I finished in February was How to Write Love Poems That Don't Suck by Delia's and C. White. So this is a little instructional book that I got many, many, many years ago, probably in like 1999 or 2000, with the Delia's catalog or with a Delia's order or something that was in my basement box books. Because I'm working on my Read What You Own challenge, I've been trying to read these like little books that sometimes I wouldn't read because they seem like kind of a waste, but I would love to get them off my shelves and out of my hair and have read them. This is not a book for me. This is a book made for children and for teens about how to write poetry, but it does have some interesting ideas for poems that you could write. It's told in a very silly early 2000s, late 90s kind of way. The verbiage that is used, the language that is used, and then also talking about like your crush or your sweetheart. It was lovely and nostalgic and made me think of Delia's and made me think how much I loved the Delia's catalog and I idolized the Delia's aesthetic, and just the story that was made up in my head about Delia's, this went right along with, as well as the compilation albums they put out, as well as the other things that went along with the Delia's clothing catalog. And I miss it. I wish Delia's was still around in a real sense. So I was glad to have read it. I will be keeping this at the end of the year just for nostalgic reasons, just as a souvenir, but this is not for me. This is for kids, and I think if you get your hands on it, it would be great for teenagers or young people. The last book that I've read so far in February is All That Is Secret by Patricia Rayburn. This is an Anna Lee Spain mystery. It is the first in a series. This is a book written by a Black author about a Black protagonist in the 19-teens in Denver, Colorado. So Anna Lee Spain is a theologian, professor, and student, but she is like faltering with her relationship with God a little bit, partly because her mother left her when she was a baby, partly because her father is an alcoholic and has had a tough time and they have kind of a strained relationship. But when she finds out that her father has been found dead, fallen out of a moving train, she decides that she really needs to leave Chicago, where she's been living in a boarding house with a friend of hers, and go to Colorado and try to figure out what happened to her father. So right off the bat, a lot of crazy things start happening to Anna Lee. There's a young man who she met in the very beginning of this book who tags along with her as kind of a stowaway on the train. She is immediately accosted. She is immediately assaulted, has to jump off of this moving train, and that's just the beginning of Annalie's adventures to try and find the truth about her father. She knows right away that it's foul play, and it's pretty obvious, but we get to follow along with her as she meets various people, one of them being the priest of her father's church, who has implored her to come to Denver as well. He also knows that her father's death was not an accident. So Annalie and this preacher and various other people that she meets, some of whom she knew as a child because Denver, Colorado is where she grew up, some of whom she re-meets, some of whom she meets for the first time, are all wrapped up in this mystery. And throughout this mystery, Annalie uses her connection with God and tries to refocus her connection with God to help her along the way. This was a fun, fine, cozy mystery. There's definitely a lot of talk about racism. There's definitely a lot of talk about colorism. There's a lot of talk about abuse. There's talk of the KKK. There's talks of sexual abuse. There's talk of all sorts of bad things, murder, obviously, and there's a lot of talk of God. I guess I would call this or qualify this as Christian fiction. I don't think that I really know what that is because I don't think I've ever really read Christian fiction, but like there is a little bit of a love story that blossoms, and that is very chaste, and it is very slow burn, and it is very sweet, and there's no explicit nature to it at all, which is nice. And then I think also Annalie's struggle with God and her relationship with God plays a very prominent role. Annalie also loves Sherlock Holmes, so of course she does want to be an amateur sleuth as well. But I really liked that this mystery didn't make her a Sherlock Holmes. She was not a Sherlock Holmes. She was not deducing things the way Holmes does. She was just using some advice that she found in his books and her love for mystery novels in general to help her solve this case. I would call it a cozy mystery. I would call it a Christian cozy mystery because it was not explicit in its violence either. There is a lot of violence. There is blood. There is a little bit of gore, but it's not like horrific. It's not, obviously they talk about the KKK and people killing people and, her father got murdered and things like that. So it's not that there's no violence, but the violence isn't explicitly gruesome and graphic. I would highly recommend it if you want to read Christian fiction that is Black and that is a mystery. I would highly recommend it for a mystery novel written by a Black author. I did enjoy it. I don't know if I'll necessarily continue on with the series. I read this one on audio. The reason that I read it was because it was one of my free borrows with Hoopla. Although I really liked it, I think there are other mystery novels and other novels in general that I have read recently by authors of color that I would choose over this one. So I'm not necessarily saying I will never read the rest in this series, but I'm definitely not going to seek them out right away. But those were 3 more books that I read in February, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. It is February 17th, and I have read quite a few more books in February. The next book that I finished in February was The Intuitionist by Colson Whitehead. This is technically the second Colson Whitehead that I've read, because I did read The Nickel Boys, which I loved. It made me cry. It was like the first year I was on BookTube, the first year I was back to reading. It was one of the most impactful books in my BookTube history, in my BookTube life, I think. And I guess in my reading life altogether, in a way, because like I said, I was just really getting back into reading, and it was when I was like starting to really read a lot. So I love The Nickel Boys, and then I tried to read The Underground Railroad, and I just found it too upsetting in the first few pages. Too much rape, too much sexual assault, too much horror, that I couldn't really get into it, and I DNF'd it, and I unhauled that one. I got this one sometime in between those, but it took me a really long time to read it, partly because I kept thinking it was The Institutionalist, and then when I realized it was The Intuitionist, it kind of changed my whole idea of what the book was, so I had to let it lie for a while so that I could come back to it and be ready to read it, and in February I was. This is about a young woman who is an intuitionist. She works for the elevator company, and she repairs elevators by intuition. So in this kind of reimagining of 1940s, 1950s America, we're in a big American city ostensibly New York, although I don't know if it's actually stated to be New York. I can't remember. Right off the bat, we see that our main character is a very straightforward, practical person. She really loves her job, and when we first meet her, she is working on an elevator. You're learning as she works on this elevator what a elevator repair person in the traditional sense is, and then what an intuitionist is, and an intuitionist can intuit what is wrong with the elevator. She's like, I'm never wrong because I can intuit what the elevators need and what's going on with the elevators. But then we see that there has been a really surprising crash of an elevator where an elevator has plummeted. This hasn't happened in many years. It only happens in certain places. It was an elevator that our main character worked on. So her loyalties are drawn into question. They think because she's never made a mistake, because she's never gotten a diagnosis of an elevator wrong, that she must have somehow sabotaged this elevator. And then we see how like elevators play into the whole society and how important they are in this mid-century feeling atmosphere, and how the different schools of thoughts of elevator repair kind of clash, and where intuitionists kind of came from, and how they have a mentor slash leader who wrote a book about elevators and about intuiting the repair of elevators. And we see that this is like a big part of the population are like elevator people and elevator repairmen and elevator innovators and things like that. So the story is really about our main character and how she decides to investigate, and the people that she meets and the things that she finds out about why this elevator fell, and the different political parties that are involved, not only within elevator repair, but within the city in general. Mobsters and politicians and all sorts of people have their fingers in the different pies, and elevators are one of the major pies that everybody wants a little piece of. Our main character has a couple of contacts. She's the first Black woman elevator repair person, and that definitely plays a role throughout the whole book, and race plays a role throughout the whole book. Not only is she dealing with the stigma of being a woman in a man's vocation, not only is she stuck in the limbo that is this kind of burgeoning civil rights time period in this version of America as well. Not only is she a Black woman, not only etc., but like all these things are kind of stacked against her. All these different elements play a part in her life and how she's trying to prove that she was not responsible for this elevator catastrophe. It reminded me a lot of the Claire DeWitt series, in that there's this sacred text and this enigmatic man who created this text, and people kind of blindly follow it, and the idea of intuition, the idea of the interconnectedness of all things, and the idea of feeling very confident, like being the best at what you do, is very Claire DeWitt, you know? So it reminded me a lot of that. It also reminded me in its absurdity and its satire of this particular time in the world, and its secret organizations and its mob connections and these different elements that are at force like behind the scenes that our main character is discovering. It reminded me a lot of The Crying of Lot 49. So if you're interested in those two kinds of writings, I think this one is somewhere in between. It has those clipped, almost noir quality that both those books have, but in Claire DeWitt, it's a lot more gritty, although this has some grit for sure, especially like in the depiction of the racism that happens to our main character. There's also like violence in this, there's also people being tortured, there's also mob activities. It definitely has some grit, but it's somewhere in between those two books, I think. So of course, I really, really like this. And I think this is one of those books, and there's a couple of books like that I've read recently, where once you read the ending, you're like, oh, and like, it's not that it's a reveal, it's not that it's a twist, but once the ending happens, you see everything that has gone on in a different light. So then you're like, okay, I see what happened. Those kind of books really make me want to go back and like reread them. So I'm definitely very glad that I got to this one finally. It took a long time, and it's so different from the Nickel Boys, but it did make me want to pick up more Colson Whitehead. I think I have one more book by him. No, I have two. I have Sag Harbor and I have Harlem Shuffle. And And I think all of his books are very different, so I definitely want to pick up more. The next book that I finished in February is Chronos by P. Djeli Clark. This is a short story. It's part of like a time traveling short story collection that I get with one of my subscriptions, which I know I really just need to cancel it. I don't even know why I still have it, except that I like to read these short stories. So I have read one other P. Djeli Clark, which is Ring Shout, which I absolutely love, and Chronos was really fun. Chronos refers to Saturn eating his children and the Titans, Roman mythology, as well as the William Blake painting of Chronos. I think it's William Blake, right? That really disturbing painting, the giant eating his children. This reminded me a lot of some of the short stories in Friday Black. It's a little bit of like Afrofuturism. It's a little bit of the idea of retail and menial work and how that's going to look in the future with like the idea of racism, tourism, and time travel, and the idea that you could role play killing Black people and you can rewrite history within the manner of retail. Really interesting stuff. I think it's worth it just to go in and read it. If all those things that I said sound interesting, then I would definitely give it a try. I love P. Djeli Clark's writing from what I've read, and I will definitely read more from that author. I'm excited to do so. The next book that I finished in February was 5 Midnights by Anne de Villa Cardinal. This is a young adult novel. This was my February pick for TBR Spin. 5 Midnights follows our young main character, Lupe, who is of Puerto Rican American descent. She lives in Vermont with her father. Her mother is gone, and her father has not taken this well, and he has turned to drinking. They do take an annual trip to Puerto Rico to visit her father's family every year. This year, right as she gets on the plane, her father tells her that he's not going and that she has to go by herself. Luckily, her aunt and uncle live in Puerto Rico, and she's really close with them, and she loves them. Her uncle is a police chief, and they bond over things like CSI and crime scene investigation TV shows, and he tells her over the phone all about his cases. So Lupe is really excited to be on her own. She's 16. She feels like she's enough of an adult that she can definitely handle this. She has some reservations, but when her uncle sends a patrolman instead of coming to pick her up herself because he's involved in a case, she decides to insinuate herself into her uncle's work by going to the crime scene. And at the crime scene, she learns that a young man was killed, mauled, maybe murdered by an animal, murdered by a person, they're not sure, but it's a gruesome scene. He was a drug dealer and he was involved in gangs, and right off the bat, Lupe knows she's going to try to help her uncle figure out this case, partly because she feels like an adult, partly because she loves this kind of investigative work, partly because she notices right away some weird things and kind of gets involved in this case beyond even what she thought she was going to. We're also following Javier, and Javi is friends with the young boy who was killed. He's a little bit older, he's 18, he's cleaned up from drugs, he's no longer with the gangs, but he's really sad that his childhood friend has passed away, and we see the circumstances leading to more of Javi's friends passing away, to Javi and Lupe coming together to solve the question of these murders, the question of these deaths together. I am not much of a YA reader. The reason that I read this YA book is because I picked a lot of YA books to read on my TBR Spin, because I have books that I want to read, or at least I want to give a try to, so I just need a reason to read them, and I think the TBR Spin is a perfect way to do that. 5 Midnights felt very slow. It felt very like drawn out. It felt very boring in places to me as an adult reader. I think as a teen reader, I would have really liked this. I would have loved the setting, which was cool and I did enjoy as an adult reader. I would have loved the little bit of romance, because isn't it every teenager's dream to go away on vacation and fall in love with someone, or at least have like a romance with someone? Who's doing what? The mystery felt very drawn out. The mystery felt very obvious. But like all those things would have been fine, I think, if I had read this as a teenager, and I think I would have enjoyed it a lot more. Overall, I thought it was good. I thought it was interesting. I would continue on with the series. There is another book called Category 5. There is question in this book of whether Lupe is going to stay on Puerto Rico, or if she's going to go home to Vermont, or if she's going to travel between the two more frequently. So I don't know if the next book is following Lupe. We also meet Marisol. We also meet Javier. We also meet Father Sebastian. So there's lots of other people who the next book could be following as well. And I'm interested in enough that I would definitely read it. I wish that this was on audio, because I think I would have had a more fun time reading this on audio. I think it would have just gone faster. It would have felt faster. There's a lot of Spanish in this, so I think listening to that on audio would be really fun. So maybe I'll try to find the next book on audio if possible. The next book that I finished in February is Against the Current, which is number 1 in the Spice Isle Bakery Mystery series by Olivia Matthews. I read the second in this series last year for some reason. I can't remember why, but I didn't realize that it was the second in the series until I was well into the book. I just wanted something fun. I'm trying to read Black History for Black History Month, as I do every Black History February, but also as I do every month of the year. I just try to concentrate on it a little more in February, and everything I had to read just felt really heavy and really hard and really sad. So I wanted like a light, fun, fast-paced, easy book to read by a Black author, and I chose this one. The Spice Isle Bakery series follows Lindsay, who lives in Little Caribbean, I think it's called, in Brooklyn. It's an area in Brooklyn, living her lifelong dream by opening a bakery with her family. The bakery is getting ready to open. Someone who owns a bakery nearby comes in and causes trouble on their soft opening, and Lindsay is kind of forced to like kick him out of the bakery, and as she does, she maybe says something to the extent of, "You'll be sorry." And when he turns up dead, she is, of course, the first suspect. The only suspect, it seems like, to Lindsay, so she decides that she needs to solve this case on her own. That's exactly what happened in the second book, too, except it wasn't her, it was someone else. But it was nice to see the beginnings of Lindsay's bakery and how her family comes together, and we get to meet her family members who are involved in the bakery and her extended family who come to help her friends. We get to meet people in the neighborhood who show up in the next book. We get to meet her high school crush, who is now a homicide detective trying to prove himself. I think the second book was much stronger. This one had a lot of exposition. It had a lot of setup. It had a lot of nothing time that was going on. I thought it was like a very obvious mystery. If I recall correctly, the second one was pretty obvious too, but the second one just felt easier to get into because you weren't being explained like every minute of every day of like what was going on in the bakery. Not that I don't love books about the service industry. I do. That's one of the reasons that I really like this series. It just felt so preliminary, so set up, so much explanation of what was happening. And in the second book, you just didn't have that much explanation. But it was nice to get a little bit of a better understanding of Lindsay and her family and the characters. And this definitely was a fun, fast-paced mystery that I was happy to read before I moved on to something else. I will definitely continue on with the series. I think there's only one more book in this series, so hopefully we will get more in this series. I really like this series so far. I like the Caribbean flair. I like the information about, I think they come from Grenada, and their lives and their food. This is another cozy mystery. I've read a couple of these recently where there's like recipes in the back, which I think is such a fun idea. And just culturally in Brooklyn, Little Caribbean is fun to read from. So I'm definitely going to read the third in the series, and I hope more do get written. The next book that I finished in February is March Book 1. This is by John Lewis, Andrew Iden, and Nate Powell. And this is a biography of John Lewis's life. We technically start off on the famous march that John Lewis was part of that turned extremely violent. But then what we really do is go back to 2009, and John Lewis is getting up. He's getting getting ready to go into the office, and as he goes into the office, he meets two young boys who have come to see his office, and he starts telling them the story of his life at the behest of their mother. We see how he was a young boy in Georgia, how he had wanted to be a preacher, and how he learned about Martin Luther King, and how he discovered the idea of preaching nonviolence, preaching peace, preaching for civil rights, for equal rights, for Black people, for women, for other causes that he's seen. And at this time too, the Rosa Parks historical event is happening. He goes off to college. He sees the bus boycott. He sees all sorts of different things, and he becomes intricately involved in the lunch counter sit-ins. Don't look at that page. There's definitely the N-word in here. There's definitely a lot of racism. There's definitely a lot of serious, scary things that happened, and a lot of discussion about why the fight for civil rights and the fight for equal rights for Black people in America is so important. Of course, I cried during this book. I feel like crying right now. I feel like crying whenever I talk about things like this. But this was great. It was wonderful. I really like the illustration. Even though the cover is gorgeous, I was super happy that the inside is black and white. I don't love every single panel. I think it does a really good job balancing action, facial features, the body of the story, dialogue, history, flashbacks. Like, I think it does a really, really good job at it. And I'm super excited to read the second and the third books in this series. And then there's another companion, I believe, to the 3 March books that are also written by John Lewis. I think that are more about the rest of his political time. I think this is his life leading up to the famous March. And then the other books I think are beyond that, even though this touches on the later history of his life as well. So I really enjoyed this one. Super happy to have read a graphic novel. I think I'm going to try and read a graphic novel every month, just like I'm going to try and read a NYRB book every month this year in 2026, and I look forward to reading more. The next book that I finished in February was A Distant Father. This is by Antonio Scarmetta, and it is translated from the Spanish by John Cullen. How cute is this little edition? I absolutely love it. This is just a little translated book that I didn't really know much about, but I picked it up at a used book sale. I always look for translated books that I don't know much about and try to pick them up. This author is well known because he wrote Il Postino, which I guess was made into a movie. I don't know what that is. That movie is familiar to my brain, but I don't exactly know what it is, and I didn't look it up. I just went into this one pretty blind, and it is about a young man who lives in kind of a remote, forgotten village in Argentina. He is the village schoolmaster, and he went away to the larger city to get his education, to go to college. And on the day that he came back, he stepped off the train, and his father gave him a kiss, stepped on the train, and returned home to Paris and left our main character and his mother alone in their small village. And it like devastated both of their lives. And our main character has never really understood why and has never really found a reason why. He thought he was going to go on and live in different cities and teach and do all these different things, but because his father left, he was stuck there. His mother never recovered. They have a loving and wonderful relationship, but they're really their only like companions for the most part. There is one man, the miller in town, who is friends with his father and who our main character thinks knows more about his father leaving than he's letting on. So our main character does make friends with the miller and try to extract information about his father from him. Our main character is disappointed that his father hasn't written. He's disappointed that he doesn't hear from him. He's disappointed that he's 24. His life is like pretty much over. So when a young student asks him to take him to the brothel, our teacher, he's not going to take the student, but he kind of gets it in his head that he needs to go to the brothel in the nearby city. So he and the miller go to this brothel, and while our main character is in the city, he runs into someone that he never expected to see. So the rest of the story goes from there. This story is under 100 pages. I loved this one. This reminds me of my reading of Silk by Alessandro, what's his name? I can't remember his name, but I read a short book like this last year and I absolutely loved it, and I had the same experience. I read this all in one sitting. It was so fun. It wasn't fun. The subject matter is not necessarily fun, but the progression of the story is very captivating, propulsive, and short, sharp, as Simon Savage would say, and it's told in all these very short chapters. Some chapters are just a page, some are more like 5 pages, and I loved it. I definitely highly recommend. If you're looking for something super quick, super easy to read, packs a little bit of a punch, has a little bit of a same kind of ending like I was talking about before, where it's not a surprise, it's not a revelation, it's not a twist, but it kind of makes you go like, oh, and you look at the whole rest of the book that you just read a little bit differently, and I love that. So those were several more books that I read in February, and when I read some more, I will let you know. It is February 26th. The next book that I finished in February was The Autobiography of My Mother by Jamaica Kincaid. I love Jamaica Kincaid. I love Jamaica Kincaid. Well, I don't know if I love her. I've never met her, but I love her writing and I love her books. Autobiography of My Mother is kind of what it says on the tin. It is a biography, an autobiography looking at a young woman whose mother died in childbirth. Our main character, Zula's mom, passed away during childbirth, at childbirth, and that has always kind of hung over Zula and created in her this void, but also this connection with her mother that other people don't have with their parents, because she never knew her mother, because she was shuttled off by her father, who dearly loved her mother but who had to work and do other things, couldn't care for her, to a woman who didn't love her, who didn't show her affection. And then when she did reunite with her father, he had become a hardened man. He didn't have the capacity for love that he did for Zula's mother to give to his daughter. This whole story is just our main character's life. It's her figuring out who she is, loving herself, because she wasn't given love, she didn't understand love. So the love she came to find for herself was totally, wholly like self-realized and self-educated. So she loved her body, she loved her smile, she loved her smell, she loved when her breath smelled, she loved when her armpits smelled. She took upon herself to get everything done in life that she needed to do. She took it upon herself to write to her father and ask him to take her back. When her father did take her back and she realized that he had a new wife who was going to not only not love her as all the other people in her life did, but potentially harm her, she took it upon herself to extricate herself from that situation. When the situation that she finds herself in becomes untenable, she moves on. And the whole time she feels confident and safe and secure in her knowledge of herself. Her mother is a part of her. Like, her mother's not a character in this book. We don't learn the history of her mother. Not really. I mean, little snippets, but it's all from the perspective of our main character. She is a sexual creature. She is a creature that demands touch and recognition and reassurance of her existence. Even though she does that for herself, she requires it from other people as well. She's just a really interesting, crude main character in a lot of ways. And I thought it was interesting because I read Annie John a few years ago, and while I don't remember every detail of that story, I do remember it almost being the opposite of this story, where Annie John's mother was very overbearing. Annie John's mother and her had a very close relationship when they were younger and then split apart. How Annie John kind of came to respect her mother but had to extricate herself from her mother to become her own whole person. Whereas our main character in this book, like, is only her own person. There's no one else for her to depend on but herself. It is the story of her growing up and becoming a person in the world and what she thinks about having children. I think the thing about Jamaica Kincaid is just her writing is so captivating. It's very simple, but it is beautiful. It's not over elaborate, but it is compelling and it makes you want to keep reading. I read this one on audio, which I would highly recommend. Robin Miles does the narration and she puts on a Antiguan accent or an island accent. It's a really great audiobook, and it is confronting in a lot of ways because it is a little sexy, it is a little gross, it is a little disturbing. There is, of course, degradation of women and sexual assault and things like that, grooming, sex with minors, and abortion, and miscarriage, and so many other things. And it's written very in your face. It's just such a really interesting story, and it was just really interesting to follow our main character's life, and I really enjoyed it. The next book that I finished in February was We Are the Leaders We Have Been Looking For by Eddie S. Glaude Jr. This is a nonfiction book, and it is split into 3 or 4 different parts. It follows lectures that Eddie S. Glaude gave when he was teaching at Princeton University. He was something high up in Princeton University for a long time, but he is also a writer. I've never read a full book by Eddie S. Glaude, but I do have several of his books, one of them being Begin Again, which is a book kind of talking about James Baldwin's idea for America and his hopes for America and how we really need that in our current day. So this is kind of similar, where it does blend a little bit of personal history, but it's more about other people, about Malcolm X, about the Black Power movement, about the civil rights movement, about all different things, and talking about that history in the idea that the leaders that were around then are not around now, but we are the leaders that we have been looking for. So specifically designed talking to Black Americans, but talking to anyone who believes in equality, believes in civil rights, believes in equal rights for all people, men, women, queer people, all sorts and varieties of people. So I thought it was really interesting that I read this now. I've had this one since 2005. I got it at a used library sale, and I didn't know anything about it except that it's Eddie S. Glaude, and I want to read the books that he's writing. And recently I've been thinking about how there are not the leaders, the Black leaders, and the Black Power movement and the civil rights movement that we need in the country right now. I've been talking about it a little bit with my family and my friends and saying, like, I wonder why there hasn't been another Malcolm X. I wonder why there hasn't been another MLK. Very timely with the death of Jesse Jackson. You know, we lost John Lewis not too long ago. We're losing the people who were in those movements and understood those movements, were fighting for equality. So I was thinking, well, how can we bring up a person to do that, to embody those things and to inspire and to motivate our country and the people who feel like me, the anti-racists and the people who seek equality and the people who believe in equal rights. And this book is like saying, don't think that. Like, you should not think that. Like, he basically, Eddie S. Glaude basically said to me, like, what are you talking about? One, it is obvious why we haven't had an MLK. It is obvious why we haven't had a Malcolm X, you know, but on the other hand, he's saying those people, and Jesse Jackson he mentions, and Obama he mentions, that they almost pigeonholed our country into thinking that only one type of Black man, only one type of Black leader, not just men but women too, could enact those movements, could produce those reactions, could inspire the country, could inspire people, could inspire the Black population, could inspire the population that are eager for equal rights. And he's saying, like, don't think about it that way, because really that idea is pigeonholing what people can do and what community can do, and how it's up to every single person to carry on the work that those people have done, but it's not for one person to do. It's not for one charismatic leader to do. We are all leaders, and we need to be thinking that way with everything that we need to do. We need to be voting with our dollar. We need to be voting. We need to be talking to our friends. We need to be forming community. We need to be helping outreach. We need to be doing grassroots things. We need to be doing mutual aid. You know, all of those things that those men were doing and women were doing and leaders were doing, all those things that they brought to the surface and made apparent. We should just be doing, and we will be the leaders that we're looking for. So it was a very interesting time for this book to come to me, and it was a very interesting book to read, and I did really like it. It's very academic, and I think even though Eddie S. Glaude has a very beautiful way of writing, he writes very academically, and this very short book took me like 2 days to get through, partly because I also tabbed a lot and I did annotate some things. I was listening to it on audio, and he reads the audiobook, which is great, but I had to keep going back and repeating areas and re-listening to areas to be able to tab, but also to kind of exactly understand what was going on. I do also think that this didn't have a lot of actual actionable suggestions to do. Like, it said, follow the lead of these people. It did say to live your life the way that you think life should be lived. It said to live your ideals. It said to talk about them, to be outspoken, to protest, to do all those things, but it didn't tell you how to do that. Like, it didn't really help you with how you were going to proceed in your life like that. And I also think it was kind of optimistic in that it didn't set you up for the failure that you were inevitably going to constantly be running into. It didn't let you know all the times that you are going to fail, that people are going to disappoint you, that the world is going to disappoint you. It didn't give you any fortifying procedures or resources to like keep moving forward. But overall, I thought it was very interesting. I will definitely be keeping this one, and I will definitely be reading it again. I will definitely be reading his other work and then coming back to this alongside his other work and trying to live by the example that this book set, that we are all leaders and we should all be doing everything we can and living our lives the way that we know they should be lived. The next book that I finished in February was Die Mayor of Harlem by David Henderson. David Henderson is a poet from New York who lived in New York and New Orleans, was mentored by Langston Hughes. So he was writing in like the 50s, 60s, and 70s, kind of after the Harlem Renaissance, and he wrote for multiple people and did multiple jobs and wrote poetry, and Langston Hughes was a mentor to him. He also knew Zora Neale Hurston and other writers who were still around at the time that he was writing. And his poems are kind of like long, and they have many multiple parts, and they have lots of kind of interesting line work where things are split up between various lines. His poetry reminded me a lot of Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who I read for the first time last year, I think, but it has much more to do, obviously, with the Black experience, with his experience in New York, with his experience in New Orleans. There was a really great New Orleans poem in here that I loved, and I liked a lot of this poetry. I thought a lot of it was really interesting. I thought the way that he wrote it was interesting, and the cadence was interesting. I do think it was a little bit disparaging to women. I do think it was a little sexist. I do think there's some obvious like misogyny in his work, but overall, I thought it was a really interesting collection, and this was someone that I didn't know anything about. I got this book at a used book sale from my local used bookstore. It was $1, and I'm so glad that I read it. And I just think that finding poetry and reading poetry that you've never heard of and that you don't know anything about will really open you up to learning more about poetry. Like, if I had never read Langston Hughes at my friend's house when I cat sit, I wouldn't know who that was, and then maybe I wouldn't have found this, or I wouldn't have found this as interesting. So always good to read more poetry. I really enjoyed this one, and I would love to find more David Henderson. I think he is like mostly forgotten. I don't know, maybe that's not true. Even Lawrence Ferlinghetti, who I don't hear a lot about, is more well known, it seems like, in literary circles than Henderson, but I would definitely love to read more of his work. The next book that I finished in February is So Long a Letter by Mariama Ba. This is a African modern classic. It was written in, I think, the 80s? Yes, 1980. Ba is a Senegalese author, and this is a modern feminist take on Senegalese culture. This book is written as a letter, so long a letter, a very long letter, to her best friend. So our main character has gotten a letter from her best friend, and then this whole book is basically her reply, talking about everything that's going on in her life, because our main character's husband has just passed away. But that's kind of the least of her problems in a lot of ways, because this husband was not only unfaithful, not only took another wife, but really broke our main character's heart doing that, and did it in kind of a like underhanded way. So our main character met her husband, fell madly in love with him. He was not the man that her mother wanted her to marry. He was not the man that she kind of thought she should marry, but she married for love, and she had 12 children with him, bananas, and she loves her children dearly, and she loves her husband dearly, and she thinks that her life is going well. But through this series of letters, through this very long letter, we see that her husband has moved out of the house. He's abandoned her and their 12 children and left her for a younger woman. And not only that, but this younger woman never really wanted to marry him. She did it for her mother, who wanted his wealth and power. Now that wealth and power is pretty much dwindled to nothing, and our main character is going to be left with basically nothing. She kind of talks through her emotions with this, and talks through the idea that she could have left him, she could have separated. It was at a time in Senegalese culture where she would have been able to do that, but how could she have gone on? And the only thing she ever wanted to do was be married to this man and love this man, and now that's gone. And not only is it gone because he left her, but it's gone because now he's passed away as well. And through this letter, we also find out about her best friend who she's writing to, who was the person who left her husband. So when her husband was forced to marry someone else by his mother, when he kowtowed to his mother to marry another woman against her wishes, she was like, I'm out of here. And she took the children and she left, and she became an independent woman. So it's kind of talking about the old way of doing things, the new way of doing things, the idea of feminism, the idea of women being independent, the idea of the old ways of marriage and multiple marriage, what is that called? Polygamy, that, you know, doesn't necessarily fit in the modern world in Senegal. Obviously, some women love that, like it, deal with it, whatever, but our main character is kind of grappling with those two ideas. Like, she feels like she has to do it because she loves her husband so much, and she feels like she's not equipped to cope with doing things the new way by separating from her husband, but alternatively, she's not coping with doing it the old way either. I thought this was going to be really dry. I thought it was going to be really hard to get through. I thought it was going to be really dense, and I put off reading it for a long time for that reason. I also thought there would probably be a lot of sexual assault in this, a lot of horrible crimes against women, and there really weren't that many, which, you know, knock on wood, like, any book without rape is like shocking to me at this point. I'm so glad that I read this because it was so fascinating, it was so interesting, it was such an interesting look into the mind of a modern woman, modern to 1980, in Senegal, and the clashing of the old ideas and the new ideas, and just the way that cultures change, and the influence of other cultures on your culture, and how maybe you never appreciated that part of your culture in the first place. Just really fascinating, really good, and quite easy and quick to get through. There is a little bit of notes in the back which just have some of the descriptions of words or meanings of words from the Senegalese culture. It's just a really interesting book, an interesting subject matter, but done in an epistolary form, which of course I love, and a super compelling read. Like, you're either learning about the best friend, or you're learning about our main character, or you're seeing the day-to-day. So every day, every different part of the letter is a different part of the story, and you're compelled to keep reading and find out. Maybe you're learning about the history of how these people got together. Maybe you're learning something about their children. Like, really fascinating, just a really great read. Definitely a modern classic, definitely should be taught in schools, definitely should be read by many. The last book that I've read so far in February is Between the World and Me by Ta-Nehisi Coates. This is the first Ta-Nehisi Coates that I've read. This is probably his most well-known nonfiction. This is a short book, sort of kind of written as a letter to his son. I mean, technically it's written to his son, but like, that framing device really goes away very quickly. Like, it says son. Other than that, it doesn't feel like a letter at all, except that he's talking directly to his son, not you as the reader, but his son through this letter. And it's telling his son, who is now a young man, who is now in his teens, all about Coates's experience growing up in Baltimore and his experience growing up Black in America. And of course, a lot of it isn't good. Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about racism, talks about colorism, talks about inner city life, talks about city life in general, talks about having to navigate gangs and different bad influences, but also navigate being a young adult growing up in the 80s and 90s in Baltimore. It talks about his time going to Howard College and how that really changed his life. It talks about the time meeting his significant other, I'm not sure if they're married or not, his son's mother, and talks about what he wishes for his son and the influences through the civil rights movement and through different political leaders like Malcolm X, like MLK, like Obama. It talks a little bit about 9/11 because they moved to New York just a little bit before 9/11, and talks just about the state of the world for this whole time as it relates to him and his life as a Black man. So it was really, really interesting. I don't know if it was striking to me as I've heard other people talk about it. It definitely is in conversation with The Fire Next Time and mentions James Baldwin, mentions The Fire Next Time. It reads a little bit like that because it is the story of his life, but it is also the story of his hope for his children, just like The Fire Next Time is the hope for James Baldwin's nephew. So I did really like it, like I said, and I would definitely read it again. I love this cute little edition too. How adorable. I read this one on audio, and Ta-Nehisi Coates does read it, which was nice. This also has photos, so I think I would like to go back and reread it again. And maybe underline some more things. I did annotate this a little bit and tab some things. This is another one that I felt like I kind of had to keep backing up and paying attention to, which is great. I love to pay attention to books, but I think I would have get even more out of it upon reread. I think it's a perfect book to read and probably should be required reading as well, just like a lot of these Black authors probably should be. The Jamaica King too. Those were 5 more books that I read in February, and when I read some more, I'll let you know. Okay, so I did not finish anything else in the month of February. I read so many good things. I'm really excited. I read for Black History Month. I read a lot of books by Black authors. I always read Black authors. I try to read Black authors every month. I try to read people of color every month. So Black History Month is just a way that I get to read more of that and that I get to maybe delve into some of the more social political things or more of the history that I've been wanting to do but haven't been in the mood for. Like, definitely I think reading months like Women's History Month in March and Black History Month, Pride Month, and all of those help me feel in the mood to read history of those topics. And I think that that is why they're very valuable. Like, I think we should be reading those authors and those stories all year long, every month if possible, but in the particular history months, then maybe delving into some of that history. So I was able to do that. I was able to read my graphic novel for the month. I want to try and read a graphic novel and an NYRB book every month in 2026. So my NYRB book was Cassandra at the Wedding. This was a great queer classic. I read African work. I read the sequel to a crime series that I like. I was blown away by some translated work. I got to read poetry. I read my TBR spin book for February. I read one of my favorite authors. I love to read from my favorite authors. What a fun time. And I got to finish like a lot of little books that I've had on my shelves for a long time, with the idea of still doing my Read What You Own challenge and like getting things off of my shelves. So happy that I hit all my goals. I know it's only February, and I was like kind of blown away by some books that I read this month. Like, there were quite a few books that I've read so far this year that by the end of them, I was like, oh, okay, it's time to go back and like reread that whole book again. I definitely think that some of the nonfiction that I read, I will be revisiting as well. Overall, a fantastic reading month. I hope you had a great reading month in February. Let me know if you've read any of the books that I mentioned here. Let me know what you thought of them. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!